Good afternoon, and thanks for joining us today. My name's Erol Harvey, and I am the CEO of ACMD. I'd firstly like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which we work today, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and recognize and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to the lands and waters of Victoria, which is where I am, but also to the lands and waters of all of Australia. Today's webinar is brought to you by ACMD, which is a new medical research institute dedicated to medtech. And if you haven't heard much about ACMD, it'll be hosted or housed on the campus of St Vincent's Hospital, Melbourne, right in the middle of Melbourne CBD. So like this nice rendering behind me. And it's a collaboration between St Vincent's Hospital, Melbourne, 5 universities, so the University of Melbourne, the Australian Catholic University, RMIT, Swinburne, and the University of Wollongong, 3 research institutes, St Vincent's Institute, the Barnix Institute, and the Centre for Eye Research in Australia. And we've received great support from the Commonwealth Government of Australia and the State Government of Victoria. At ACMD, we firmly believe that engineering is the future of medicine, and that's the topic that we're going to explore today. Why are we putting engineering and medicine into the same sentence? What's the role of multidisciplinary teams in speeding up medical discoveries, and also have a look at Australia's potential to take a leading role on the global stage in this area? You're welcome, and we would welcome your input and questions, and you can submit questions at any time during the session. Use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, not the chat, use the Q&A, and I invite you to do that during the session. So don't wait till the end. If you have something that you would like to raise, please use the Q&A box straight away. Right, well, so that we can dive straight into my topic, I would like to introduce my co-presenter for today's webinar, Dr. Alan Finkel. Alan was the Chief Scientist of Australia until the end of 2020, and in case any of us need reminding, that was the period that had the first global pandemic hit that we'd had for over 100 years. But before that, Alan has been Chancellor of Monash University, President of the Academy of Technology and Engineering, a highly successful medtech entrepreneur. And Alan, if we go back far enough, you were even working in neuroscience. What were you doing there?
Errol, thank you. Well, when I grew up, I was fascinated by the idea of being a doctor, but I never made the decision to do that. But I was fascinated by everything. I ended up doing a PhD in electrical engineering. But I was fascinated by the brain and what I'd heard about the electrical activity in the brain. So during my PhD, and then subsequently also during 2 years as a postdoctoral researcher at the Australian National University in the John Curtin School of Medical Research, I effectively became a cross-dresser. I picked up neuroscience as well as electrical engineering. What I was doing research on the way that individual brain cells communicate with each other, but I also made the equipment to do it. Actually, probably the most important thing in my engineering life was when the head of the department said, "Alan, this is an electrical engineering department. You need the best equipment to do the work. You can add anything you want, as long as you design and make it yourself."
Yeah.
That's a good training deep dive. But eventually I realized my heart wasn't in doing the research, it was in designing the equipment that made it possible. So on my own volition, I wasn't pushed. I jumped the fence out of academia, grabbed my wife, and off we went to Silicon Valley in 1983, which is probably before most people had heard of Silicon Valley in Australia. And I spent 23 years there running the company that I founded, making electronic equipment and software, measurement devices and software for scientists at universities, scientists, pharmaceutical companies and biotech companies who were themselves developing new medicines or medical implants and devices. So I never was on that lab bench side of making things. I was making the equipment and software that helped them to do that. The kinds of devices we made, Erol, were for measuring, of course, the electrical activity in brain cells, which helped scientists understand memory, neurodegenerative diseases, hearing and vision. We made devices to measure genetic expression. These are called DNA microarray devices, scanners, that helps to profile the response or the likely response of a patient to a therapeutic treatment. And we made high throughput imaging systems that in pharmaceutical companies, they use to rapidly screen hundreds or thousands of medical candidates. Look, I left that world in 2006 and, as you said, did other things. But even as Chancellor of Monash University, I was still drawn by these sorts of things, and I became one of the significant philanthropic supporters of the Bionic Eye Project at Monash University, which was a collaboration between the neurosurgeons and neurophysiologists and the engineers. So I've moved on in recent years, in the last 15 years, but I remain interested.
But we're dragging you back to those origins again, Alan, with this. You and I have talked in the past around why engineers approach problems in a different way and what the engineering technique is for handling complex problems. You mentioned to me that in talking to some of your colleagues recently, you said engineers are the world's great optimizers. What did you mean by that?
Well, engineering as a discipline, well, I would say that every discipline is a science as well as an art. Some more so art than science, et cetera, but engineering is also a blend, but to me, it's the art of optimization. I often say engineering is the art of optimization. Easiest to understand what I'm talking about if you think about building a bridge. If you design the bridge and your focus is on absolute perfection, bad luck, no one will build the bridge because there won't be enough money available to build it. If you compromise, that is a complete and utter disaster. People will die. So you have to optimize and get a really good result that you can be confident in. Now, I think that art of optimization actually applies to everything in life. Yes, medical devices for sure, but also policy formation. And I find that in virtually everything I do to deliver an optimized response, I follow what I call the engineering method. So we'll go from the description of it as optimization, but the method that achieves that is a 5-step method. The first, and this is going to sound really trite, the first step is to define the problem. I can't tell you how often, and it's the majority of cases, I see people jump to a solution before they have clearly articulated the problem. Well, engineers are trained not to do that. Define the problem that you want to solve, then analyze it. That's step 2. Step 3 is to develop that first solution. Step 4 is to test it, improve it, and keep iterating till you make it better and better. And step 5, sometimes forgotten, is to deliver and support a fully packaged, optimized solution to the problem. And I do find I apply to virtually everything with one exception. I apply to developing government reports, developing company strategy, developing products. The exception, of course, is my marriage.
Yes, I know several colleagues that use Excel tables to manage their family outings and stuff. So even there, you can use the engineering approach. Alan, I guess we're looking at blending at ACMD researchers with, the end stage clinical translation stuff. So bringing together clinicians. Of course, the really important voice of patients as well, the end user, the people impacted by this. But a lot of the innovations which will come out of medtech change the way people work. And so bringing along the doctors, the nurses, the allied health professionals is also important. The researchers from our university partnerships are trained to generate new knowledge. Whereas in the translational bits, that engineering approach that you've just described, it's different. The drivers are around getting something out, but making sure it fits purpose and is safe. how effectively can we bring those together? Where do you see the complementarity, but maybe also some of the stress points?
So I guess the collective word in the English language for what you're describing is collaboration. That's a very much abused word. It's a wonderful thing to achieve. It's got to be effective collaboration. I mentioned marriage before. To me, effective collaboration is like a marriage of love rather than an imposed marriage or a marriage of convenience. Collaboration is important. Look, a lot of people say that the new oil is data, but we live in a very sophisticated society, and it's much more than that. There's intense interest in health. And so the new oil is arguably all the accoutrements of that. It's the diagnostics, it's the vaccines, the treatments, and the therapeutics. And around the world, from China to the United States, from England to Austria, investors and governments are pouring money into health and medicine. So there's enormous opportunity. It's how we seize the opportunity. There's money to be made, but the competition is fierce. So success will go to those who execute most intelligently. So that really is describing those organizations who pull together the talented individuals whom they need to work on the problem identification and the problem analysis, the solutions development and the testing. So you need it all. You need the doctors and the nurses who have a problem to solve so that they can deliver improved outcomes for patients. You need product managers to translate those problems into a language the engineers and the financiers can understand. You need the engineers and the researchers to develop solutions. And then you keep going. You need the doctors and nurses again and their patients to test the solutions in the real world. So it's a virtuous circle. And success will go to the fastest, which really means those organizations who put the most talented individuals under one roof. Now, you can either do that metaphorically, like we are today, virtually or symbolically, or you can go all the way and get them under one roof in a single building, and that gives you the fastest possible communications channel. People talk about megabits per second. When you're face to face with somebody, it's terabits per second. It's infinite bandwidth effectively. But I do want to point out that collaboration in and of itself is not the means to the end. Collaboration doesn't guarantee success. You need a process. You need the people. You need also the other C word. You need to be driven by a sense of competition. But I would like to think in Australia, we're collaborating so that we can compete with the rest of the world. And that's the kind of thing that my understanding of the Aikenhead Institute is going to deliver.
Absolutely. And so the building is that place where we bring those different elements together and hopefully get the terabyte interactions happening. There's a question that's come up in the QA. Somebody's remarked that the art of optimization, Elon Musk has said that one of the biggest traps for smart engineers is optimizing something that shouldn't exist. How do we make sure that we're working on the right problem in medical research?
Well, that goes back to my very first step in the engineering methods. Identify the problem, articulate it. Check with people. Is this a problem worth solving? If we solve this problem, will society be better off? Some people might use a narrower lens. Will I get rich? But identify a problem that is worth solving. So I totally agree with Elon Musk. Don't just go out and solve things for the sake of it. Don't jump into solutions. Identify the meaningful problems.
So I just take you back to last year. We were hit by COVID. You were chief scientist. We had not had this happen, though there were pointers that it could happen, and we narrowly avoided several global pandemics. Bang, it happened. And there was an awful lot of uncertainty as to what the impact would be on our system. But one thing that we were struck by was the potential of lots of very sick people in ICUs, and we had a shortage of ventilators that we would need. Australia was then near the bottom of the shopping list for that. Lots of other people were trying to snaffle up ventilators that were made overseas and in warehouses. But you you had an intervention there that had to draw together in a collaborative sense to address that problem. Can you say something about why you had to do that? And also, what were the elements of success that we could learn from that?
Yeah, well, without going into all the details, Errol, let me say that it was pretty early in the piece, in March of last year, that I was approached by a few people who had been looking at the early pandemic modelling and come to the conclusion that Australia was going to go into this explosive spread of the disease and that we would need beds and ventilators for 50,000 people at one time in ICU clinics. And I was asked to look at how we would meet that need, not for the beds and the staff, but for the ventilators, the ICU quality ventilators. And I stopped at that point and I spent 48 hours frantically expanding a network of people to talk to, basically emergency room physicians, anaesthetists, government procurement agency experts and others, to try to work out for myself before I started going and finding a solution. I wanted to know exactly the extent of the problem and what we needed. And in that rapid fire period, from really working with experts, not from me being an expert, but working with other experts, the doctors and nurses, the experts in the field, I worked out that it didn't matter how many people were going to end up in bed. We didn't have the staff to deal with 50,000 on ventilators, and that the most we could reasonably ever cope with using would be 7,500, which is a hell of a lot. But at a stretch, we might have needed that. And then when we looked around, we could only see 2,500 available. So we needed to get 5,000 ventilators. So that was the problem. Get a bunch of ventilators. And I won't go through, we ended up with a 5-track strategy, but let me ignore 3 of the tracks and just talk about the 2 of them that involved local engineering and local product development. So one was the ResMed track. ResMed is a company that most people would know of. They do the CPAP, the masks for sleep apnea, but they also have a line of medical grade ventilators, including ones that can be used for invasive ventilation with a tube. World-class company, really well known. They had a problem, though, that their supply chain was being interrupted. Their manufacturing for these things was in Sydney and Singapore, and their supply chain was being interrupted because governments were clamping down on the flow of components across borders. You remember the toilet paper phenomenon in supermarkets. There was a national scale government-led toilet paper phenomenon when it came to ventilators and personal protective equipment and diagnostic kits and everything. So the problem that ResMed had was not their ability to build. They had the people and they had the production line, but it was supply chain interruptions. And so the Commonwealth government assisted ResMed through using ambassadors and others in the overseas posts to help unblock those imposed shipping holdups. And we helped to make a case with the other governments that we need to have bidirectional flow for benefit of both sides, that just being selfish wasn't the solution. So the problem was supply, component supply, and the solution was working with the company and other governments to ease that. The second was, we thought, look, the international situation is so fragile, we need a second line of supply in Australia, but ResMed was the only one. So we needed to somehow bring up another supplier. But normally these things take, 4, 5, 6 years from concept to development. But we were fortunate enough to come across a company based in Melbourne called Grey Innovation that has experience in designing sophisticated equipment, including occasionally medical equipment. And they had the vision to pull a consortium together. But the problem is they didn't have the funding to upfront pull the consortium of companies together. So that was the problem. The government said, okay, this is important. And they wrote a contract, a many millions of dollars contract, and paid a substantial fraction upfront, which enabled Grey Innovation then to pull together about 50 companies, of whom 15 made major contributions. They didn't start from scratch. They took a design that they licensed from a UK company called Smiths, but then they used superb local skills and they built every component locally for this machine, except for the silicon chips. They built everything from scratch locally, including the test systems, and they did the whole thing in 4 months from concept to delivery. So it tells you something about the talent that we have to draw upon, but having the talent without the focus of a problem needing to be solved and the money to grease the wheels isn't sufficient. You need everything to deliver a complex solution.
I hear from a lot of my business colleagues that that impetus of having a major purchase order and then having to deliver against that, it can be an even more effective driver than, for example, a research grant or a development grant. But of course, in order to deliver something, it has to be of world standard. It has to meet the quality and the regulatory requirements that are the highest. There's no way you can compromise on that. How do you think Australian industry is placed to meet those sort of challenges? And I guess part of what you were doing with the ventilator was working with the regulator as well.
Yeah, so look, Australia, going through a few points that you made there, a procurement contract is gold for two reasons. There's guaranteed money if you deliver and do what you're asked to do, but there's crystal clear clarity of what it is that you're trying to produce. So you can get your product managers, your engineers, all the people in your company working with clarity and with the money known to be coming at the end of the task, because you've got a goal contract with a government or with another company. So that's critically important. And it's almost better than just having money in the bank for not clear purposes. You asked whether that's better in a way than money for research. Well, it depends. If you're a researcher, then money for research is the best thing. But if you're looking at delivering a solution to a problem, it's actually pretty good if you drive things with a procurement contract, because that flows all the way down back to the research that's necessary to develop the elements, the small elements that have to come together to make the big full-time solution. So yes, it's really important. You mentioned the regulator at the end. That was actually one of the other tracks that we followed. At the time, we were being bombarded by well-meaning, intelligent people who wanted to make ventilators, but they all thought it was easy. You know, it's like having bellows and pumping air in and out of people's lungs. And if you had to write what a ventilator does in one sentence, you'd say it's like a bellows that pumps air in and out of people's lungs. But people's lungs are delicate. We're talking about human beings here. It's not nearly as simple as that. And we got very frustrated with people coming up and saying, look, I just built this gadget in my garage. Can you give me a procurement contract? Grey Innovation wasn't like that. They understood that they needed 50 companies in their consortium, 15 major developers, all of whom were experts in their respective areas. So in order to help those well-meaning startup developers not waste their time and not waste the government's time and my time and others, one of the other things I did is I spent a little bit of time working with the emergency room physicians and the technicians and nurses to come up with a feature specification or a product requirements document that said, if you were going to build a ventilator for emergency room use during this pandemic, here are the minimum features that it needs. And the list that we came up with was the minimum features, but it was still a pretty long list. And remarkably, once that was accepted by the TGA and published, the rate of fly-by-night ideas dropped dramatically. But a few really serious players did come up with solutions, but then the pressure to procure dropped off because we turned out not to need a lot of ventilators. The 7,500 that we had on the shelf were more than enough.
So, I mean, a recurring theme in our conversation has been about making sure that you understand from the outset what the requirements are for your medtech device. You referred to the product requirements, PRD, and I guess one of the central themes of the programs that we'll be developing at ACMD is to lay out the in an engineering sense, the process steps where you start with the consumer voice, the user voice of what it is that you're your solution should address. And then you track through your development and at the end prove, often through clinical trials, that your device meets those requirements. So I'm just looking at some of the questions in the Q&A around, the role of end user consumer representatives in that process, but also how you build in the concept of a quality system, the continuous improvement process, which is really important in that cycle as well.
So when I first started my company, Erol, I used to do all these things, seat of the pants, and I was lucky, it worked out. But we weren't initially making medical devices. They were all for research purposes. Then we decided to make a medical device, which was a serious medical device. It was an electrode stuck into the brains of living human beings in a neurosurgical operating theatre, connected to up to 150 volts of stimulating electronics. So it was a serious piece of medical invasive equipment. And in order to do that, we had to put ourselves through a quality certification process. The one we did was called ISO 9000. And that forced us to sit back and document the processes. And we then found that everything we identified for that was applicable to our non-medical devices too. They were really good processes. And they encapsulated in formal processes the things we've been talking about. So we basically had a rule for ourselves that every product or set of products that we were going to make from then on had to start with a marketing requirements document. That's where people from the company, often it was myself, even though I was the CEO, I'd wear many hats, as most people will, but the marketing research people would reach out to the scientists or the doctors or whoever the end users were to find out from them what the problems were needing to be solved, or with our existing product line, what feature improvements, future enhancements would make it even more desirable and useful for them. So we would come up with a marketing requirement document that, as I said before, would translate the need. I learned, you never give people what they ask for. Bad. You give them what they need. And there's a difference. We won't go into it now, but there is a difference. But you know what they need by speaking to them and probing them and teasing out their ideas. So all of that would come into the marketing requirements document, which would paint the big picture of what the end users, patients, doctors, scientists, others would need. And it would identify in very broad terms what the products would be to fill that need. And then the product managers working with engineers and the market research people would do a PRD, a product requirement device that sets out in meticulous detail, but just in writing, what the features would be in that ideal product. And then when that's agreed, you'd sit down with the engineers and argue the case on every single one of those features before you started working on it. And the beauty of that is the engineers are smart, creative people. They wouldn't be doing engineering if they didn't want to create and do things. And so they help the product specifiers to improve the feature specification and also at the same time specify features that they could actually build. And then the engineers would go out and write an engineering specification. And those three layers of documentation really help to bring all the needs together and ensure that you would deliver your products optimally as quickly as possible.
Yeah, and that process step is structured in, as you say, ISO 9001 is a way to monitor that your business processes are meeting those objectives. And 13485 is another one that is very focused on medical devices in particular. And I guess, again, at ACMD in our training courses, that'll be a major part of the exercises to make sure people understand the principles behind what you've just described. I'm just looking at the Q&A. A comment that's made, which is relevant to what you were just saying, is that products always have room for improvement. At what stage in product development do you deploy or receive feedback from the market? And I guess this is where it's important for the development team to freeze the design at some point, make sure that this is the thing that we're going to test out in the clinical application, and make sure that you've optimized as much as you can in order to get the product out there. You said before that you could continue to spend on development. I guess you would use up a lot of money and still not end up with a product in that process. But I think, wouldn't you agree that this is, again, the role of the development team and the engineering approach there?
Yes, but it's more difficult than you would think. I had an engineering manager of the engineering team who reported to me, and he had a very strong philosophy of identifying the time to shoot the engineer and ship the product. But the question is the threshold, right? And my personal philosophy was very much wedded to a relentless commitment to quality. And so I always wanted to ship the best product that we could make with the existing technology. And so there was a real tension between knowing when to stop and shipping it. And that's just something you have to debate and discuss. Now, in some cases, you don't have a choice on quality. If the quality issue is related to safety, you've got to keep working at it. In fact, I don't think you should ever compromise on the quality. You want to optimize the quality. Quality is critically important. Sometimes quality comes from making the device simpler. That improves the quality of the user experience. What you find is that straight after you ship the product, you realize what you should have put in to make it even better. But that's okay, because that just becomes the basis of the next generation of the same product line. And you can have, well, think of an iPhone, we're up to iPhone 13. Should they have waited for 20 years to try to get all these features into the first iPhone? Of course not, because you could never have gotten to the iPhone 13 quality if you didn't have the field experience of working with customers through that market research process to know what they want, and also picking up the new technologies developed on the basis of fresh science, fresh engineering, and build them into the new products. So there's no hard and fast rule, just like in the ISO 9001 that I mentioned, Erol, and you're going to teach. When we first looked at it, we thought, oh my God, this is going to make our whole company very procedural. But it's not true. The people who developed ISO 9001 allow you to implement it in a way that is suitable, optimal, if you like, for your own company. So it actually can improve you rather than hold you back.
Absolutely. I want to move on to a couple of other points, but just to close off on the ventilator one of the questions in the Q&A, we did actually end up with locally built ventilators. How many were delivered out of that program so far that you know of?
The program's closed. It was in the order of a couple of thousand through the Grey Innovation one, and probably about 1,000 through the ResMed one. And then some of the ventilators that we found were just by going out and looking for what was there, sitting in boxes unopened or in ambulances rather than in ICUs. So it was a multi-track strategy, as I said.
Yeah, great. Look, one of the things about the building that we're putting up at ACMD is that we want to bring together lots of different disciplines and skills. So from the scientists, the biotechnologists, through to engineers as well, entrepreneurs, clinicians. We have a teaching area for nurses, allied health professionals, doctors, and so on. One of the, if you go back to the training behind a lot of these disciplines, you go back to university structures. One of the questions that's come up in the Q&A, to what extent do you think that the faculty structures work against this sort of multidisciplinary approach that we've been talking about today?
As Chancellor, I was very aware of that, and we were challenged with that kind of question often. But you need two things. And if you think about that word disciplinarity, you need people who are experts in their discipline. So you do need specialists, and they come from the faculties, but you need to share those skills in order to produce a product or a solution to a need. That means they need interaction and shared ambitions. So I do think that having faculties is a reasonable way to go. It's worked for hundreds of years, if not 1,000 years, and so I wouldn't throw it out. But you have to have processes such as a facility where people can get together to enable the interchange of those ideas. Let me take it even a bit more extreme. When we made products at Axon, some of the ones towards our later years, whilst I was still there, were really complex: mechanical, fluidics, chemical, software, all sorts of things. And the naive thing to do would be to go out and get 10 biomedical engineers to work on it because they know everything, right? But we never did, not once. We got PhD specialists who happened to be experts in software engineering development. We got master's specialists in mechanical engineering. I had a PhD in optics, just doing the lenses for the microscopes that we were doing. So we did multidisciplinarity, not by trying to package it into one person or a whole lot into individuals, but by bringing individual experts together and meeting almost daily, certainly weekly, understanding what the end objective was and using their deep expertise. You need that depth of specialization. That's what faculties deliver.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. I guess we should also touch on a really important feature of modern medicine, and it's been very true in looking at how we're monitoring the spread of COVID, and that's the role of data science, large data sets, very fast information about the progress of diseases and in population groups and so on. How do you see opportunities for the data engineering side of medicine as we move forward out of this post-COVID time?
It's very, very complex, and I don't think it's difficult. No one's really got it right. Take modelling. How many of the models have you seen be completely wrong versus how many you've seen be right? Well, partly it's because you're trying to model so many things, not just the disease and the nature of the virus and human physiology, but human behaviour, their individual risk-taking behaviour, how they respond to government directions, the policies in place at the time. So it's not a lack of data or the ability to process the data, it's to know what to do with it. And it may be that unless we have dozens of pandemics behind us to learn from, we won't be able to get it right. But that's not the way we want to go. Part of the problem is there's a lot of really bad data out there. I mean, the number of just woefully poor quality studies on ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine that completely confuse the market. It's incomprehensible how many of them are out there. So we do need human beings, not just computers, with what I call BS antennae, to sift the data before it goes into the models, to sift the data before it's used to inform decision-making or the development of new solutions. And I worry that there's too much emphasis on the sophistication of data manipulation and modelling and insufficient training and commitment to BS detection.
At the risk of linking that last phrase with a trendy area of machine learning, how do you make sure that we're going to get the best out of some of these artificial intelligence type processes, still, meet the safety and regulatory issues and not stray into this BS world of oddities that can easily come out of manipulating these large data sets?
Yeah. So artificial intelligence is just amazingly powerful, but the garbage in, garbage out rule still applies, and artificial intelligence relies on being trained from a data set and knowing what the endpoint objectives are and going through a machine learning process. So if we get it right, you get wonderful tools. And if we get it wrong, it'll just be as bad as the worst human being. So I applaud the attempt to use artificial intelligence more and more in medical diagnostics and drug discovery, protein folding and formation, but you can't yet, maybe never, I don't know, but you certainly can't yet take the well-trained, astute human user observer out of the equation, because that's where the real BS detection resides. It's in the human brain.
There are opportunities for tremendous speeding up of complex analysis by using some of these techniques. For example, there's a project going on within some of the partners at ACMD looking at using machine learning techniques to interpret mammograms. The current manual process is working, but it has a capacity limit. And by putting some of these newer techniques in, Helen Fraser and her team, quite a large team of different collaborators, is looking at ways to speed things up. I guess looking forward, whenever we come up with new technologies in medicine, it often generates more data. And we have to try to figure out how to get the right information out of those. Surely there's going to be a kind of a new profession there that will emerge in terms of the data analytics.
Data analytics is crucially important. But go to your example of image analyzing of the mammograms in order to give a refined diagnostic. My understanding is a lot of those artificial intelligence routines are actually better than many physicians. But I'm not sure that you'd want to go and have an operation purely based on that without that review by the human being. So I agree with you, it absolutely can speed up the management of a large number of mammograms and bone x-rays and CAT scans and things that have to be read. They don't yet, and perhaps will never take the human being out of the equation. But it's a lot of data to be analysed, and the machines just spit out more and more. So cut through is important. And so it's like a loop, isn't it? Artificial intelligence and data giving you more to look at, and then you need artificial intelligence to look at it. But the human beings need to be there. In some areas, they don't. Just facial recognition, 10 years ago, it was almost laughable how bad facial recognition was when done by computers and artificial intelligence. And now they're consistently better than human beings.
One of the projects that I was working with at the Bionics Institute, we have a very specific issue around trying to get the data analytics working on the signals we were processing. And in looking at the problem, it looked like a very similar sort of problem to the one that astronomers face, where you measure, in radio astronomy, these very noisy signals from space, and you have to find very minute, very fine detailed information in there. The problem was that when we spoke to the astronomers to help us in our project, there were not enough of them, and they were super busy, and there's an awful lot for them to do in their own fields. And one of the questions that's come up in the Q&A is that, the oil and gas industry tends to consume an awful lot of engineering talent in this country. What do you think the prospects are to get some of those best talents focused in on medtech?
That's a very fascinating question. Money is a big issue. If they're being well paid in those industries, good luck getting them to come into the conventional medical research salary structure. But it's more than money in many cases for the engineers and the technicians and the scientists. It's where their interests are. Look, you've got to make it exciting for them in order to attract them across. A lot of those people will go into the renewable energy area before they would even begin to think of the opportunities in the medical research area. But I would say that if you can get the word out to them, just how much engineering integrates into medicine today, they would find it fascinating.
And I think that is what we're sort of reaching out to, is that there are great career pathways for people that want to merge the two. I've spoken to some people around our work in some of the medical technology space, and then halfway through the conversation, they've admitted, you know, I'm actually trained as an engineer, and I've been wondering how I could get into all of this. So I think we are looking at the potential for new career pathways and new types of jobs coming out of this field.
And it's also a question of which carrots you put in front of those engineers. So many of the ones who are mechanical engineers and systems engineers, they're going to want to work on mechanical prosthetics, you know, for walking and controlling devices through electrical pickup. So medical devices would attract them probably more than medical instrumentation. So go forward with the most appropriate carrot every time.
One of the other questions in the Q&A is around hype. The thing with a lot of emerging technology fields is that people can easily overpromise what it can do. And particularly in a medical field, it's very easy to tug at people's heartstrings by implying that you're the great solution, where in fact perhaps avoiding the hard work that has to be done. Do you sense that the discussion within the Australian context is at the right level in terms of hype? Are we underrepresenting the opportunities, or have we got it about right, or are we over-egging it?
I certainly haven't myself come across much overhyping in Australia. It's a big phenomenon in Silicon Valley, as you know, and you read about it all the time. And the most outrageous example was Theranos and their blood diagnostics equipment that didn't exist and was already being sold. That's overhyping on steroids. So if anything, it's more that we're underhyping. And that's really where you need this confluence of people who don't even have a medical background. They're market research people, they're economists who can speak to the doctors and patients and identify the needs and grab the attention of the scientists and the engineers who can then fill that void with solutions.
And part of that solution has to be how you get it out into the real world. And this is where a little bit of entrepreneurship matters too. Particularly if you decide it's going to be a commercial model that you're going to use to get your solution out there. But it's tough in the early days when the market for your new idea is very small. What do you see as the role of the entrepreneur in getting some of these technologies out into the real world?
Well, huge. Entrepreneurs are very special people. They're one-people shows. They want to do everything. And their biggest problem is realizing they need other people to help them, right? But for an investor, it's all about people identification. Really, the product almost comes second. You'll find that a lot of venture capitalists will talk about the fact that they're more so investing in the management and the senior technical talent in the firm than the products, because they're convinced that the really good people can do it again and again. We haven't been as successful as we would have hoped in commercializing high-tech and medical products in the past, but it's been accelerating. There have been successes in recent years. There's certainly more investor interest and more money around than there was in, say, 5 to 10 years ago. Startups always think about the problem being that they're looking for investors, but the investors, their problem is finding startups that are credible enough that they can invest in. So often they've got money that they can't spend. And if they see it brought together with credible management and talented people, it makes it easier. They themselves don't want to pull the bits and pieces together. They want it to be delivered to them. That's why really ACMD, you've got the potential in a way to be a one-stop shop for many of those smart investors.
And I think that's a good point. For those of us that have been in this field for a few decades now, the environment in terms of investor interest in the field is much better than it's been for a very, very long time. The quality of the talent that we have here is also technically excellent. You could argue that we're probably a little short on the number of experienced entrepreneurs, but again, using international linkages and so on, you can do that. I mean, you went to Silicon Valley for you had to move. I think you said 83. You had to move your whole family across to there. Hopefully, you can now get the global benefits without necessarily needing to move as much as you had to. But that linkage is certainly very important, and I think that's part of what we're aiming to do within the sort of ecosystem that ACMD will be part of, is increase that talent pool of experience and good investable projects.
The talent pool is the single most important thing that limits so much development. There's just not enough. I'm the chairman and founder of a education company that provides resource materials for teachers, but it's also a high-tech technology platform for interactive teaching with the students. And so we depend on having software engineers. We need experienced teachers to write the content, but we need software engineers. It's very, very hard to hire people, and it's been exacerbated by the pandemic. But you would see that same problem in every field of high tech in Australia. We need to be investing. Part of the problem is, as I was saying before, is that commitment to deep discipline instruction and training. There is a tendency in some universities and some departments, but not all, to try to make it easy for the students. And I would put it to you, the worst thing you can do for an undergraduate student is to make it easy for them. What you really need to do is set the bar of aspiration very, very high and then help them to get over it. So if we did that more uniformly, it's done very, very well in some universities and some departments, but if we could do that more extensively, we would actually be developing more of our own homegrown, highly skilled talent pool. But we're not unique. Every country in the world has these kinds of problems. So we need to attract foreign experts, trained workers, and we are doing it poorly at the moment because of the pandemic, but we've never been able to get quite as many as we need. But the things we need to attract them is a beautiful lifestyle. If they're going to pick up and come with family to live in Australia, well, we've got a beautiful lifestyle other than lockdown. We do have a fabulous lifestyle, beautiful cities and beautiful countryside, so people want to come, but they have to have the jobs and the challenge. And if they're going to come, they not only want a fabulous lifestyle, but they want really fulfilling careers. These sorts of startups can deliver that.
That is a brilliant segue to what we're creating at ACMD. So look, there's lots of students who are also tuned into this webinar. So I'm sure some of those messages are well landed. I'd love to invite everybody who's listening in on this to come and visit the ACMD. You know, that looks like it's been done. The reality is we're still putting up the building. It'll be finished at the end of 2024. So I can't give you an actual visit, even if we were allowed to visit the CBD, which hopefully we will be allowed to soon. But look, literally hundreds of people, including clinicians, scientists, and engineers, have been working on the design of this building behind me. And most of them have amazingly been doing it even during lockdown. So as a bit of a substitute visit, and given we're in the last few minutes of this webinar, I'd like to show you a virtual visit, at least to the outside of our new home at St. Vincent's Hospital site. So like many people, I haven't had the chance to get into the city much over the last couple of months, and I probably hadn't realized the extent of the bleaching that's happened around the buildings. We'll all have to get back in and give it more color. But look, there are significant opportunities still for organizations and individuals to contribute to this vision of ACMD, and we'd welcome your support to the Capital Building campaign. As we've spoken about today, buildings are where people come together. It's the home where you can get this very dynamic environment, this interaction that'll enable, amazing medical breakthroughs. So we'll have ACMD as one of the premier teaching hubs dedicating to this area. So we'll have teaching schools for clinical, nursing, allied health, and biomedical researchers. The building itself is more than $180 million venture. We've had some great support from the federal and the state government, but we do need some additional funding to make the vision a reality. So I can't think of a more exciting project at the moment than this in Australia. And, we have a very big potential to directly impact on patients and the community. There's still naming rights available, opportunities on the building, and we'll share the contact details of the St. Vincent's Foundation's CEO, Lynn Amy, with you in just a moment. Today's webinar has been recorded, so if you want to watch it again or would like to share it with somebody else who may be interested, we'll send around the link. But also recognize there's many people listening who may be students or medtech entrepreneurs or researchers. Maybe this will be your next home. We'd love to stay in touch. Please go to the ACMD website, acmd.org.au. There's a contact us link there. And if you hit that, we'll make sure your email address gets to the right person, and it may well be me. I'd very much like to talk with you, and we can also put you on the list to keep you updated as to where we are with the ACMD project. But let me just thank you, Alan, for your huge and insightful comments on this area. I can't imagine anybody could have listened today and not have realized that engineering is, of course, the solution to the medtech opportunities ahead. And I think we have a tremendous opportunity in Australia to have truly globally impactful work going on. So Alan, thanks for your time today. And I'd also like to thank you for joining us today, and very much look forward to staying in touch.